Racist judge insults black man in court. Just minutes later. Police surround the courthouse. Welcome back to Meaningful Stories. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and start the story right now. The Jefferson County Courthouse in Birmingham, Alabama, loomed like a fortress of secrets. Its stone walls steeped in decades of unspoken truths. The air inside was thick, not with the sticky heat of the southern sun, but with a weight far heavier. A silent pact woven into the oak-paneled corridors. Everyone who crossed its threshold knew the rules of Judge Meredith Langford's domain. For 24 years, she'd reigned from her bench, a queen of iron and ice, her sharp eyes slicing through attorneys like a blade through silk. She rarely lifted her gaze over her reading glasses, her voice a measured whip that lashed without ever rising, a tone that crushed dissent before it could draw breath. Her legacy wasn't etched in marble or lauded in law journals, it was a shadow whispered in back rooms. A ghost that haunted bar association murmurs. To black attorneys especially, her courtroom was a gauntlet. Her rulings a rigged game no one could prove but everyone felt, until today. Darnell Hayes strode through the heavy oak doors, his polished shoes striking the marble floor with the precision of a metronome counting down to war. At 48, he was no stranger to this lion's den. But this time, the air crackled differently around him. He wasn't just another defense lawyer on the docket, another name to be chewed up and spat out. Today, he carried a weapon Judge Langford couldn't see, a blade forged in years of grit and guile. His reputation stretched beyond Alabama's borders, built on the bones of cases no one else dared touch. His knack for dismantling prosecutions a thorn in the side of judges like her. But as he approached the defense table, her eyes locked onto him, twin daggers glinting with a hatred that needed no words. It wasn't about the case. Not yet, it was about him. His very existence a challenge to her throne. The courtroom hushed as he set his briefcase down with a thud that echoed like a drumroll. His client, Tyrone Wilkes, a man shackled by a false armed robbery charge, sat beside him. Shoulders slumped, eyes hollow from too many years in a system that devoured hope. Darnell felt the weight settle on his own shoulders, a mantle of purpose heavier than any trial he'd faced. This wasn't just about Tyrone's innocence, it was about toppling a titan. About shattering the invisible chains Langford had forged over decades. Mr. Hayes, Judge Langford's voice slithered from the bench, cold and clipped, her gaze barely flicking up from the papers before her. You're already on thin ice in my courtroom. Don't waste my time today. The words were a preemptive strike. Unprovoked, a warning shot fired before the battle had even begun. Darnell's grip tightened on his briefcase, his knuckles whitening, but his face remained a mask of stone. I'll try not to, Your Honor, he replied, his tone smooth as polished steel, a faint edge lurking beneath. She smirked, a predator savoring the scent of blood. Good, I've got a full docket. And I don't need theatrics. She turned to the prosecution table, where Philip Calloway, a young assistant DA with slicked back hair and a grin too eager, stood ready to please. The state is ready, Your Honor, he said, tossing a smug glance Darnell's way. Of course they were. Stacked decks always favored the House, especially when the accused was a black man in Langford's court. Darnell leaned toward Tyrone, his voice a low anchor in the storm. We're ready too, he said, loud enough for the room to hear. A quiet defiance rippling through the stillness. Langford exhaled sharply through her nose, a hiss of disdain, and waved a hand. Let's get this over with. The trial began, not as a pursuit of justice, but as a performance, with Langford center stage, her gavel a scepter and her contempt a crown. Darnell squared his shoulders, his eyes never leaving her. She thought she held all the cards. But he'd brought a deck of his own, and the first play was about to drop. The courtroom pulsed like a living thing, its oak-paneled walls closing in as the trial unfurled, a twisted theater where justice was just a prop. Judge Meredith Langford sat enthroned behind her bench, her gavel a scepter of doom, her presence a storm cloud choking the air. Darnell Hayes stood at the defense table, his polished exterior a shield against the venom seeping from her every glance. This wasn't a trial, it was a slaughter. And Langford wielded the blade with relish. Every objection he raised shattered against her dismissals, each one swatted away like a gnat daring to buzz too close. The young prosecutor, Philip Calloway, stumbled through his arguments, A puppet with tangled strings, yet Langford guided him. Her voice a velvet glove over an iron fist, nudging him back into line like a favored pet. The jury saw it, the way their chairs creaked as they shifted. Their eyes darting between Darnell and the bench, unease flickering in their faces. The gallery felt it too, a ripple of whispers snaking through the pews. But Langford didn't care. She doubled down, her lips curling into a sneer whenever Darnell spoke, her contempt of venom dripping into every ruling. "Mr. Hayes," she snapped, her tone a whip crack slicing the air. "You're testing my patience." Then again, sharper. "If you raise one more baseless objection, I'll hold you in contempt." And finally, a hiss of disdain. "This isn't a lecture hall. Mr. Hayes, save your grandstanding for somewhere else." Darnell's blood simmered, a slow boil beneath his calm mask. Not from her insults, he'd weathered worse, but from the way she made it personal. A predator marking her prey. He needed her to keep going, to let her arrogance unfurl like a banner for all to see. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady as a drawn bow. "The prosecution just introduced evidence not disclosed in discovery, a clear Brady versus Maryland violation. I move for an immediate mistrial." The words landed like a grenade. Its pin pulled, waiting to detonate. Langford leaned back, adjusting her glasses with a theatrical slowness that mocked his every breath. "Denied," she said, her voice flat, final. A door slamming shut. Darnell blinked, not from shock, but from the click of a puzzle piece falling into place. He let the silence stretch, a taut wire humming with tension. "To be clear, Your Honor," he pressed, slow and deliberate. "You're refusing to acknowledge a Brady violation?" Her lips pursed, a flicker of irritation breaking her icy facade. "I said denied, Mr. Hayes." The room tilted. Reporters' pens scratched faster, a frantic chorus echoing the shift. The gallery buzzed, a hive stirred to life. Langford's eyes darkened, locking onto him with a glare that could have scorched steel. "You're dangerously close to contempt," she warned, her voice a low growl. Darnell tilted his head, a faint challenge in the gesture. "For what, Your Honor? Asking the court to uphold the law?" Her gavel slammed down, a thunderclap that rattled the high ceilings. "That's enough," she barked, the mask slipping, rage seeping through the cracks. The courtroom froze, a tableau of held breaths, every eye pinned to the clash. Beside him, Tyrone Wilkes clenched his fists under the table. His whisper ragged, "Man, don't let her do this to you." Darnell didn't flinch. "I have nothing further, Your Honor," he said, smooth as silk, sliding back into his seat. Langford scoffed, a victor's snort, as if she'd crushed him underfoot. But she didn't see the trap tightening around her, every word, every sneer, every overreach weaving the noose he'd spent years crafting. The jury's discomfort deepened, their glances sharper now, even the ones who'd walked in with biases of their own unable to ignore the stench of injustice. The gallery hummed louder, reporters poised like hawks. Darnell sat still, his hands folded, his face a fortress. He'd fought in hostile rooms before, but this was a crucible, and Langford was stoking the flames. Oblivious to the inferno she was building for herself. The game was hers for now. But the clock was ticking, and Darnell held the hourglass. The Jefferson County Courthouse had become a pressure cooker, its walls trembling under the strain of Judge Meredith Langford's unraveling reign. Darnell Hayes stood at the defense table, a lone sentinel in a storm of contempt, watching her every move with the precision of a hunter stalking a beast too proud to sense the trap. Langford's arrogance had sharpened into a blade. She slashed at him with every ruling, her voice a whip that cracked louder with each exchange. She wasn't hiding her bias anymore, it blazed like a bonfire, consuming the pretense of fairness. The jury shifted uneasily, their eyes darting like trapped birds. The gallery buzzed, a hive on the brink of chaos. Darnell let her dig deeper, her every word a shovelful of dirt piling onto her own grave. Philip Calloway fumbled through his questioning, a shaky-eyed store clerk on the stand stammering under the weight of coached lies. "Mr. Thomas," Calloway pressed, "can you confirm the defendant, Tyrone Wilkes, was the man you saw at the robbery?" The old man hesitated, his tongue darting across dry lips, a crack in the prosecution's armor. Darnell leaned forward, his pulse quickening. He'd seen that flicker before, the kind that unravels a case. But Langford pounced before the truth could breathe. Answer the question, she snapped, her tone a gavel strike of its own. The witness flinched. I think so, he mumbled, barely audible. Darnell surged to his feet. Objection, Your Honor, that's not definitive. Langford didn't blink. Overruled, she shot back, her voice a wall of ice. He exhaled, a slow hiss through his teeth, shaking his head just enough for the jury to catch the scent of injustice. He pressed into the cross-examination, his steps deliberate, a predator closing in. Mr. Thomas, you said you think you saw my client. How sure are you? The man faltered. I thought it was him. But, Langford's gavel hovered, her eyes narrowing. Move on, Mr. Hayes, she cut in, sharp as a guillotine. He turned slowly, meeting her gaze head on, the air between them crackling. I'd like the witness to answer. Your Honor. Her face twitched, a storm brewing behind her glasses. I said move on. Darnell held her stare, unyielding. For the record, Your Honor, you're blocking the witness from clarifying his own testimony. Her lips thinned, a warning growl rumbling low. I'm warning you, Mr. Hayes. He offered a faint, steely smile. I understand, Your Honor, he said, retreating to his seat with the calm of a man who just lit a fuse. The room teetered on the edge, tension coiling like a spring about to snap. Langford knew she'd lost the reins, her grip on the courtroom was slipping. And Darnell could feel it, a tide turning beneath the surface. His hand brushed the stack of documents in his briefcase, the weight of years poised to strike. Then it happened. The heavy double doors of the courtroom burst open with a boom that shook the walls. A sound that yanked every head from the drama at the bench. 2 federal agents stormed in, dark suits slicing through the haze, their strides crisp as gunfire. The room froze, a silence so deep it swallowed the hum of the air itself. Darnell smoothed his tie, his face a mask of granite, while Langford's confusion flared into indignation. What is the meaning of this? She demanded, her voice a brittle shield. The lead agent, a tall figure with a jaw carved from stone, flashed a badge that gleamed like a death knell. Judge Meredith Langford, we need to speak with you immediately. Her jaw tightened, a flicker of fear darting through her eyes before she buried it under judicial scorn. I'm in the middle of a trial, she hissed, clinging to her throne. The agent's gaze didn't waver. It's urgent. Darnell watched the crack widen, her composure fraying, her power teetering. Calloway stammered, should we take a recess? Your Honor? Langford's fingers curled into the bench, her voice a razor's edge. No, we are not taking a recess. The defense has wasted enough time. And I refuse to. The agent cut her off, his tone a steel blade. We have a warrant for your arrest. A gasp ripped through the room, a collective jolt that shattered the stillness. For the first time in 24 years, Langford's iron grip faltered, her courtroom spiraling out of her control. Darnell stood slowly, deliberately, his eyes sweeping the jury, the gallery, the reporters scribbling like their pens were on fire. Then he turned to her, his voice a quiet thunder. Your Honor, I believe you just denied my motion for a mistrial. But it seems this trial is now the least of your worries. Her face drained of color, a ghost staring down her own reckoning. The agent stepped forward, unfolding a sheet of paper that rustled like fate itself. Meredith Langford, you're under arrest for bribery, abuse of power, obstruction of justice, and violations of civil rights under federal law. The room erupted, shouts, whispers, the scrape of chairs as the gallery surged to life. Langford's eyes locked onto Darnell, and for the first time, she saw him, not as a nuisance to crush, but as the man who'd brought the hammer down. The trap had sprung, and the lion's den was hers no more. The Jefferson County Courthouse trembled as if struck by lightning, its hallowed air splintering under the weight of an unthinkable unraveling. Judge Meredith Langford stood behind her bench, wrists bound in steel cuffs that gleamed like a traitor's crown, her once imposing figure shrinking before a room-turned executioner. For 24 years, she'd ruled this chamber like a tyrant, her gavel a scepter of ruin, silencing attorneys and shattering lives with a flick of her pen. Now, the federal agents flanked her, their voices a cold dirge as they intoned the charges: bribery, obstruction of justice, abuse of judicial power, violations of the Civil Rights Act. Each word fell like a hammer, cracking the foundation of her empire. The echo of handcuffs snapping shut a death knell to her reign. The courtroom erupted, a tempest of gasps and shouts swirling through the gallery. Reporters clawed at their notepads, pens slashing paper like knives, capturing the quake of history unfolding. The jury sat frozen, wide-eyed statues caught in the aftershock. Even Philip Calloway, the smug prosecutor who danced to Langford's tune, gaped in pale silence, his notes slipping from trembling hands. Darnell Hayes stood at the defense table, his silhouette a pillar of unyielding resolve, letting the chaos crest around him. He'd waited for this, years of patience distilled into this single, shattering moment. Langford's eyes darted, frantic, a cornered beast stripped of its claws. Her voice, once a blade that carved fear into every soul, cracked as she hissed, "This is outrageous." The lead agent, his face a mask of granite, didn't flinch. "Take it up with your lawyer," he said, his tone flat as a gravestone. The gallery buzzed louder, a mix of shock and dark delight rippling through the pews, some whispering in disbelief, others savoring the fall of a titan who'd loomed too long. Her hands shook, the cuffs clinking faintly, a sound that stripped her bare before the very system she'd twisted to her will. She turned to Darnell, her gaze a wildfire of rage and dawning terror. "You," she spat, the word a venomous arrow aimed at his heart. He lifted his chin, his eyes locking onto hers with the calm of a man who'd already won. "This is justice," he corrected, his voice a low, steady thunder that rolled through the room. The irony hung thick. Langford, who'd preached accountability from her perch, now stood shackled by the law she'd mocked. For decades, she'd sent men to their fates with a sneer, her bias a thinly veiled blade slicing through the powerless. Now, that blade had turned, and it was her blood staining the floor. The agents moved, guiding her toward the doors, but not before one final stain. A court officer, a man who'd bowed to her whims for years, his loyalty once unquestioned, stepped forward. His hands hesitated, then steadied as he held the door open, his face blank, treating her like any common defendant. Langford faltered, her breath catching as the weight of her fall sank in. Then she stepped through, the heavy oak slamming shut behind her with a boom that reverberated like a coffin lid sealing tight. The queen was gone, her throne reduced to ash. Silence crashed over the room, a stunned hush as the dust of her dynasty settled. Darnell exhaled, his hands resting on the defense table, the pulse of victory thrumming beneath his skin. Beside him, Tyrone Wilkes stared, his voice a ragged whisper. "Man, I thought people like her never paid." Darnell glanced at the empty bench, its shadow now a ghost. "They do," he said, his words carrying the weight of years. The gallery stirred again, hushed voices rising like a tide, some in awe, others in reckoning. Reporters scrambled for the exits, their stories already blazing in their minds. But Darnell knew this wasn't the end. Langford's fall was a crack in the dam, a flood of questions poised to spill, every case she'd tainted, every life she'd crushed, every bribe she'd pocketed now clawing into the light. He'd toppled the giant, but the battlefield stretched far beyond this room. The agent's footsteps faded down the hall, and he straightened his tie, his eyes glinting with a fire that hadn't dimmed. This was justice delivered, not by the system, but through it, a reckoning forged by one man who dared to flip the script. The Jefferson County Courthouse buzzed like a hive struck by lightning, its air electric with the aftershock of Judge Meredith Langford's fall. The oak-paneled chamber, once her unassailable fortress, now lay in disarray, a battlefield strewn with the wreckage of her 24-year reign. Darnell Hayes stood at the defense table, his silhouette a quiet storm amid the chaos, his gaze steady as the dust of her empire settled. The gallery whispered in fervent bursts, reporters scrambling to immortalize the moment, while the jury sat wide-eyed, still reeling from the sight of Langford cuffed and led away. But the fight wasn't over, not yet. Tyrone Wilkes remained shackled beside him, a man caught in the crosshairs of a trial poisoned from its roots. A new judge swept in, a rush of black robes against the chaos, an older man with graying hair and eyes carved from decades of fairness. He took the bench with the weight of a sentinel, his presence a stark contrast to the venom that had ruled moments before. Darnell straightened, his voice cutting through the hum like a blade through fog. "Your Honor," he said, his tone a clarion call. "Given the recent developments, I move for an immediate dismissal of all charges against my client." The judge folded his hands. his gaze piercing as he leaned forward. "On what grounds, Mr. Hayes?" Darnell turned, his eyes sweeping the jury, 12 faces now awake, their discomfort a mirror to the truth clawing free. "On the grounds that this trial was rotten from the start," he declared, his voice rising, a tide of conviction. Judge Langford's arrest lays it bare. She was never impartial. Her rulings were a sham. Her bench a stage for manipulation. Evidence was buried, my client's rights trampled, and this case twisted into a mockery of justice. He pivoted back to the judge, his words a hammer striking steel. "Now that the architect of this injustice stands in chains, the only right move is to tear down what she built." The room held its breath, a taut silence stretching like a bowstring. The new judge studied Darnell, his face a map of measured patience, then nodded, a slow, deliberate tilt that shifted the earth beneath them. "I agree," he said, his voice a rumble of finality. "The charges against Tyrone Wilkes are dismissed. Bailiff, remove his restraints." For a heartbeat, no one moved, the weight of the words hanging like smoke. Then the bailiff stepped forward, keys jangling like a hymn of liberation. The cuffs fell from Tyrone's wrists with a clank that echoed through the stillness. A sound that broke the chains of years. Tyrone exhaled, a shuddering breath he'd held through countless nights, his hands trembling as they flexed free. The courtroom pulsed with raw emotion, jurors blinking back tears, gallery voices swelling in awe. Philip Calloway, the once cocky prosecutor, slumped at his table, his notes a lifeline slipping through pale fingers. Langford's shadow had propped him up, and now it was gone, leaving him a hollow shell in the wreckage. He didn't object, couldn't, his confidence drowned in the tide of her ruin. Tyrone turned to Darnell, his eyes wide with a mix of shock and reverence. "Man, I don't even know what to say," he rasped, his voice thick. Darnell clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Firm and steady, you don't have to say anything," he replied, his tone a quiet anchor. Tyrone rose, his gaze sweeping the room that had nearly swallowed him whole, a man reborn from the ashes of a stacked deck. Without a word, he walked out, his steps heavy with freedom, Darnell following like a guardian shadow. The weight pressed against Darnell's chest, not triumph, but purpose, a fire still burning. This wasn't just about Tyrone. It was about every soul Langford had crushed, every case she'd rigged, every bribe she'd pocketed to tilt the scales. Her cuffs were a start. But the war stretched beyond these walls, a legion of corrupted benches still lurking in the dark. He paused at the courthouse doors, the clamor of the gallery fading behind him, and glanced back at the empty bench. Today, justice had clawed its way through the mire, not because the system was pure, but because he'd forced its hand. Outside, the Alabama sun blazed, casting long shadows as Tyrone disappeared into the light. Darnell adjusted his tie, his jaw set, his eyes glinting with resolve. One tyrant had fallen, but others waited. Tomorrow, the fight would resume, because for every Langford toppled, another loomed, and he'd be damned if he let them stand unchallenged. The Jefferson County Courthouse stood silent in the aftermath, its oak-paneled walls scarred from the storm that had torn through its heart. Judge Meredith Langford's throne lay vacant, a ghost of power reduced to echoes and dust, her 24-year reign shattered in a single, seismic blow. Darnell Hayes lingered at the defense table, the air around him thick with the weight of victory, a victory carved from years of shadow and steel. The gallery had emptied, its voices now a distant hum, but the room still thrummed with the pulse of what had transpired. A titan felled, a man freed, a system forced to blink. Yet beneath the triumph, a restless fire smoldered in his chest. This was no ending, but a spark in a war far from won. He traced a finger along the edge of his briefcase, its leather worn from battles too numerous to count. Tyrone Wilkes was free, his silhouette fading into the Alabama sun, a life reclaimed from the jaws of Langford's machine. But Darnell's mind churned with the faces she'd left behind, countless men and women buried under her gavel, their pleas drowned in her contempt, their fates sealed by bribes and bias. Her cuffs were a crack in the dam, a flood of reckoning poised to spill. But the river of corruption ran deep, its currents snaking through courthouses far beyond these walls. The new judge's voice still rang in his ears, steady and just, charges dismissed. The clank of Tyrone's cuffs hitting the floor had been a thunderclap, a sound that shattered the silence of despair. The jury had watched, rapt, their eyes alight with something rare, hope. Fragile but fierce. Even Philip Calloway's collapse, his smug facade crumbling without Langford's shadow, had been a quiet victory. But Darnell knew the beast wasn't dead. Langford was one head of a hydra, cut her down, and others would rise, their scales gleaming in the dark corners of power. He stepped into the hallway, the marble cold beneath his shoes, the courthouse looming like a mausoleum of broken promises. The reporters had scattered, their headlines already blazing across Birmingham. Judge arrested in her own courtroom. The story would ripple through bar associations, law schools, the streets where justice was a whispered myth. But Darnell's fight wasn't for headlines. It was for the silenced, the unseen, the ones Langford had crushed without a second glance. He'd played the long game, years of gathering evidence, tracing her every crooked ruling, waiting for her arrogance to overreach, and when it did, he'd struck with the precision of a guillotine. Tyrone's words lingered, raw and reverent. I thought people like her never paid. Darnell had looked at the empty bench, its shadow a fading stain. They do, he'd said, his voice a vow etched in stone. When someone makes them, justice hadn't flowed from the system's veins, it had been wrested free. Forged in the fire of one man's refusal to bow. He adjusted his tie, the fabric a quiet armor, and stepped into the sunlight, the heat pressing against his skin like a call to arms. The horizon stretched wide, a battlefield yet uncharted. Langford's fall was a tremor. But the earth still hid its monsters, judges cloaked in robes of impunity. Systems rigged to shield their own. Darnell's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing with a glint of steel. Today, he'd toppled a giant, but tomorrow, the hunt would resume. If you believe in real justice, he murmured to the wind, a challenge flung to the unseen. Don't just stand there, fight for it, make it loud, make it count. The words hung in the air, a spark for anyone bold enough to catch it, a promise that this was only the beginning. Thank you for accompanying us in today's story. See you again in the next videos. Hello and see you again.